So let's rewind. October 1957, the Soviet Union stunned the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. A small metal sphere contained a simple radio transmitter. But what was it launched in? A hollowed out intercontinental ballistic missile that was sending bleep signals at low Earth orbit. Bleep, 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 just hovering around our airspace. Right there, that spooked the United States. First of all, we wondered why, how on earth did they use something so advanced and technological to launch something up there, up in low Earth orbit, if we don't have all these resources right now to send something to space? We never launched anything in space. How did the Soviet Union possibly beat us? Even though if the United States has a lot of money, we are a um, free market capitalist society, but the Soviet Union is a communist society. How on earth could they possibly beat at something so technological? Well, secondly, the United States military was also feared that the satellite's constant bleep, 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 bleep over our airspace. These signals could be spying on us, gathering intel on what we're up to. And that spooked the United States and put the United States into a constant danger to the point where we officially declared that the space race has officially begun. Because we are feared that they launch something that's so advanced and technological, even though they have, these, you know, leftovers from the Second World War, and they launched something straight up into space. We were scared that they launched something at low orbit, sending bleep signals. How was that possible that, you know, they're gathering so much intel by using these signals? We were spooked by that. So yeah, officially, the space race has begun. Now, a couple months later, on November 3rd, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the second Sputnik. On board was a dog. Her name was Laika, a stray dog found on the streets of Moscow. Laika became the first living creature to orbit around the planet. And yeah, she was successful in completing a few orbits around the planet. And unfortunately, when the spacecraft was re entering Earth's atmosphere, Laika unfortunately passed away. She only lived for 5 to 7 hours after launching. She died from overheating, and then originally the Soviet government originally claimed that she survived for days. The truth was not revealed until 2002 that states that Laika was only survived for 5 to 7 hours during the re-entry process. She overheated because there was a malfunction in one of the spacecraft that was entering Earth's atmosphere at a high rate of speed. So even though Laika died, the Laika's mission provided crucial data on about how living organisms respond to spaceflight. And this advanced that to understand how humans survive space travel. So yeah, so we took that from Laika, but again, we were spooked that you know Sputnik 2 was launched. Laika became the first living creature to be sent. And again, the space race, 1957, the space race was on. So, you know, putting dogs in space, cool. We're going to put humans into space. So, yeah. And again, that space race kept escalating months after it first started. Now, 1 year after, October 1st, 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known as NASA, officially began operations. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, which is my fourth cousin, had originally signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act earlier that year, creating NASA to lead the America's first civilian space program. And officially, um, it brought a lot of people, and became the first administrators. It became a global powerhouse to send humans, to work at NASA, engineer spacecraft. It became a global sensation, and that was signed into law in the United States in 1958. And eventually, like I said, they opened their doors and now gave them enough funding to start planning on beating the Soviet Union at their own game. So now we get into John F. Kennedy's administration, and this is 1961. The Soviet Union struck a major victory on April 12, 1961. Cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the very first human to travel into space, orbiting Earth and returning safely. This achievement of sending a first human into space embarrassed the United States to the point on May 5th, 1961, the United States tried their own hand. NASA already has enough money in their budget to send Alan Shepard to become the first American into space. But this flight was subordinated, meaning that he didn't actually complete a full Earth orbit like Gehrig had. This put the United States behind the Soviet Union. So this was an embarrassment to the United States because they found out that he didn't complete a full orbit. He was like say he took his first real kind of just a little half orbit. So this put the United States behind. So this is where we change in 1961. Only weeks after Shepard's flight, President John F. Kennedy made one of the boldest announcements in American history. Famously, on May 25th, 1961, Kennedy addressed a joint session of Congress and declared, and I quote, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." Kennedy requested an additional $7 to $9 billion for the spacecraft to accelerate NASA's effort to put the first man on the moon. To him, space exploration was more than just science. It was a geopolitical national mission. We were trying to beat the Soviet Union at their own game. The US is already behind in 1961 because of Alan Shepard's not completed orbit around the Earth. Yuri Gagarin became the first human to actually make a full orbit around the Earth. Again, the United States was behind, and already, like I said, NASA was just starting. So, in his speech that following year, he compared the space exploration to an early pioneers who crossed the American frontier, and he said, would become humanity's new frontier. So already, 1961 became the pivotal moment that we're going to be putting the first human on the moon. We choose to go to the moon, said John F. Kennedy in a National Joint of Congress. So now, the Soviet Union also used space achievements as a source of national pride. Propaganda celebrated Soviet technology and power of communism. 1963, the Soviets launched Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, presenting as a victory for gender equality in the Soviet system. This was a competition between two nations, not just technological, but it was also ideological. But also, during that time, they actually sent the first dark-skinned person and a Cuban. We have to remember that Cuba was part of the Soviet Union. It was part of the communism too, because the political nature of Cuba at the time, because it was controlled by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, who had conquered the island nation of Cuba and turned it into a communist. So by the mid 1960s, NASA began to make major progress by boosting their budget, boosting their workers, and they launched the Gemini program. It was launched to develop a technology necessary for a future moon landing. 1965, astronaut Ed White performed America's first ever spacewalk. But actually, once again, the United States was actually behind on that because, once again, 1 month earlier, before Ed White's famous spacewalk, Alexei Leonov completed the first ever spacewalk in history, lasting only 12 minutes and 9 seconds. So again, the United States was already behind now because, like I said, they waited 1 month after the Soviet Union. So they were trying to compete, but like I said, they were kind of just following behind the tail end of the Soviet Union putting the first people up in space. And then eventually something changed. As they continued to advancing, boosting more people, building new things, creating new programs, and thus the Apollo mission was born. We had Apollo 1, we had Apollo 8, we had the Apollo missions everywhere. NASA's budget was starting to grow now. 1966, the American spacecraft successfully docked in orbit, marking a critical step towards the future of lunar missions. But now everything had changed by the end of the 1960s, and still by the 60s and 70s, we were starting to get into that political violence now. But still, 1969 was a pivotal, um, major victory for the United States in the space race. On July 16, 1969, NASA launched the Apollo 11 with astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins. The mission was far from smooth. Technical malfunctions have occurred throughout the journey, but when it came to landing, Armstrong had to manually guide the lunar module to a safe landing, and thus landing on the Sea of Tranquility. And finally, as he let out the Eagle has landed. He took out, everything. He opened the panel, starting to walk on the moon, creating the first footsteps. By July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon and said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." This was a mark that said, we totally beat the Soviet Unions by planting the first flag, and we became the first humans to set a sight on something far away. We set our sights on the moon that the Soviet Union couldn't even do. You know, even though the Soviet Union has already beat us at everything, we chose to go to the moon, and guess what? We made it to the moon. We totally beat the Soviet Union at their own game by going to the moon. And successfully, we did. And the Apollo missions kept going to the moon, so on and so forth after that. And it was a very successful, pivotal moment that we said to the Soviet Union, we did it. We, as the United States, we have beaten you guys. We made it to the moon. But yeah, pivotal moment. Now, in the 1970s, we still had the Apollo program missions by capturing the famous Blue Marble. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union began to ease a little bit. Instead of competing in space, the two nations actually began to actually work together. This cooperation eventually led to the joint missions and development of space stations, paving the way for what becomes the International Space Station by using two pieces that they both manufactured, launched these two into orbit, and successfully completing. And eventually, at the time in the 1970s, yes, like I said, their tensions have began to ease. They started to become friends now. Because remember, you had Jimmy Carter as president at the time too. Sorry, Gerald R. Ford and then Jimmy Carter. So, like I said, as that comes together, the Soviet Union became chums. They started to work together, which again, that was amazing that they started to work with each other, not against each other, showing that you know everything was kind of easing up a little bit in political senses. Even though in the 1970s everything was still very violent, you still had violence, you still had the you still had civil rights, you still had a lot of these issues that was going on, but still you see places in the world that are starting to ease up. You had the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. You had other political factors starting to kind of just ease up, but there's other tensions that was going on on the globe. We had a little proxy war still going on, but still politically between the Soviet Union and the United States was starting to ease up a little bit. And eventually that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1992. Um, yeah, I think it was Christmas 1991. I think 1992. Um, Eventually, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States and Russia began to cooperating. They're rather competing in space. Once again, they were rivals that were merged, eventually becoming the International Space Station in 1998. The United States, Europe, Japan, and Canada had their own little parts of the International Space Station. But there was also one country that said, "Hey, I want to be part of you guys, and we want to have our joint collaborations." But we said to China, "You can't." The reason why China could not be part of us because you have human rights violations that we will hold against you. You have political systems and human rights concerns. You have security fears about sharing advanced aerospace technology, technology transfer from space programs that could strengthen China's military. We cannot let China come in. So you know what China does after that we said to no to China to not have their part in the in the building of the International Space Station? Well, China did what they did when we tell them no. Well, they start to grow economically. And when you have a rapid growing economy in China, well, they had money to just spend. So they eventually, their economy was growing, industrial economy was growing, agricultural economy, their population started growing. Everything was growing on their end. And they were spending money up the wazoo. And eventually they started to build up their very own space administration. These were concerns that led to the U.S. government to limit operations with China. The Wolf Amendment of 2011 prohibited collaborating directly with Chinese space agencies without special approval. So eventually, China just developed their space program and eventually led to the first taikonauts, which is their word for astronauts in China, to basically follow the same way. And eventually, what I think is what we're going to go into right now, which is going on currently, that we're competing against China to the space race to go back to the moon. Artemis gets set up. Artemis 1 has successful orbit around Earth and the moon. Artemis 2 is still in delay over the helium tank, but their mission was to send humans actually to around Earth and then around the moon. Artemis 3 will do the same thing. Because remember, originally Artemis 3 was actually going to send humans straight to the South Pole, but that was delayed until Artemis 4 in 2028. So we're gonna have two human missions around Earth and the moon, but China has spacecraft on the moon gathering samples here and there, setting up everything else. China's ambitions to set up nuclear reactors and lunar labs and lunar bases on the moon's surface by the year 2030, but also have India also competing against us as well. The United States wants to go back to the moon as well, set up the first bases before China and India actually do. Because we're competing against the two most populated countries in the world, setting up lunar bases on the moon. So yeah, we want to understand about water uses and water resources. And I also mentioned in the last video where I did talking about lunar water resources, there's a part of that video where I talked about space treaties too. Space treaties are very, very important when it comes to how a certain country or a certain area divides up their land. You can't just go into other people's section and you expand off of theirs. And there's things that you can and cannot do. There's things you can and cannot take. According to a specific treaty that the administration has signed, saying, hey, you only get this section part of the moon. The other countries will get a section of the moon. You can't just kind of like compete and say, hey, like I want to touch this resource and then expand into that resource. No, there's a specific treaty that goes into it that they had to be clear about against three political figures: the United States, China, and India, and who else is going to be competing against the United States to go back to the moon, according with these treaties, right? And that's kind of what it's becoming now. We have the accumulation of AI starting to accumulate as we're going to be building AI factories, AI catapults, moon factories powered by AI, robots, rovers, etc. But first, we need to understand we want to beat these political figures, these countries to the moon before we actually set up our missions, because we want to get to the moon first. But like I said, we have other competing sides too. Big basically when you have a thriving, like we have three big economic countries, and three highly populated countries as well that's competing against. We have advancements of technology, AI. We have lots of things, that's adding factors to just this space race itself. We are in a brand new space race, but it's still a continuation from what it was back in 19 that started in 1957. It's just a continuation of that. So we have never really ended the space race. We are in a space race because we have other contributors that are competing against us to go back to the moon. And we said we already have Artemis, by Artemis 5, 6, 7, 8, and so on and so forth. We're going to have humans, potentially landing on the moon and building lunar bases and labs and stuff. This is what becomes a space race in the near future by sending humans straight to Mars. So who knows what that's going to look like? Who is going to be competing against us to go to Mars instead? So yeah. So basically, that's kind of the brief history of the space race, about what happened from 1957 straight to currently and what's going to happen with the future. So yeah, we'll have a space race from now to when China says, well, yeah, we're going to have it by 2030, and we're going to be competing against them in 2030 to build stuff on the moon. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.